Alrighty. First thing I need to do. There we go. Now we're full screen. Now we're talking. Now we're rolling through. We're getting things done now. We're where we need to be. So, let's talk about time. Time is a very, very interesting concept. It's something that I would at least imagine most people aren't necessarily entirely too familiar with in terms of a lot of the metaphysics that underlies it and the science that underlies it as well. The primary reason I wanted to do this video is because there's a lot of talk about the nature of time. Things such as, A theory of time versus B theory of time, tensed versus tenseless, and that's what I'm going to talk about here in this video. Now, I'm a B theorist. I hold to the tenseless theory of time, like pretty much all, not exclusively all, but I mean the exhaustively large majority of relevant philosophers adhere to the tense theory or tenseless theory of time, rather. I can't think of any physicists that would, at least that are prominent anyway, that would adhere to the tense theory. All of them adhere to the tenseless theory of time. The tense theory, or A theory, it really hasn't been a major part of, or has had major support for at least a couple decades, if not longer. Probably going back even before that, and at least in terms of the science. So the distinction between the tense theory, or the A theory of time, and the tenseless theory, or the B theory of time, is namely that the tense theory of time states that the past used to exist but no longer does. The future does not yet exist but will. The only thing that can really be said to be extant is the present moment, which is in a way ever evolving into the future in certain terms. Those are just a particular way of putting it. So that the flow of time is something that is real, it's something that's objective, and we experience that. And that the present exists, but the future and the past don't. The past did, but it doesn't anymore. The future doesn't yet, but at some point it will. The tenseless theory of time says that none of that is true. All moments of time are equally real, and the illusion of moving through time is, it's an illusion. Time doesn't have any flow. Time is non-linear, and we can see this. We definitely in physics, where you can have a system and run it forward in time and backward in time, and the physics is invariant under both those methods of evolving a system, so to speak. Primarily relativity is where, and a little bit of quantum mechanics, I suppose, you might find some tenseless notions, but most tenseless notions, excuse me, that pardon me, that are, when we talk about tenseless time, a lot of the notions of what that means and why that became something that was really that became very prominent is primarily due to relativity. Special relativity, general relativity mentions it quite a bit, or at least the notions that underlie it, but special relativity is really the big one, where time is just another dimension like space. You can have two objects in space in two completely different points in space, but they still exist. Even if only one of them was accessible to you, and you could only know about one of them, they still both exist somewhere in space. And time, under the relativistic view, and I would argue time actually, can be viewed the same way, that you can have two moments of time that are different from each other, separate, but you might only have access to one. That doesn't mean that the other one doesn't exist. It simply means that you're not in a position to have access to the information contained in that moment of time. Just like, I mean, the Andromeda, there's some star in the Andromeda. You could pick any star in the Andromeda galaxy. That star exists, but we don't really know much about it because we're not in a position to have access to the information. But because we don't have access to that information, doesn't mean that the object doesn't exist. And so a good way of characterizing the B theory of time, which the A theory of time is intuitive. Most people understand what that's supposed to mean, and because it's something that we experience, even though our experience of a flow of time is illusory. But the B theory of time, or tenseless time, is a little bit more difficult, just because it's very non-intuitive. It doesn't make sense. But a good, really analogous way to put it that's intuitive is, think about the country Germany. Now, some of you viewing this video might live in Germany, and if you are, then think of a country that's not Germany that you don't live in. But for the rest of us that don't live in Germany, think about Germany. You're not in Germany. You don't know what's happening in Germany. You don't know what's happening in Berlin. You're not there to be experiencing it, to have access to the information that would inform you of what's happening. The question I want to ask then is this: does Germany not exist yet, or at all, or ever, because you don't know what's going on? Let's say you take a vacation to Germany, to Berlin. You go there. Now you're in Berlin. You're experiencing what's happening in Berlin. Great, awesome. Did Berlin not exist until you got there, simply because you weren't experiencing what is happening in Berlin? I think most people would say no. Berlin still existed and things were still happening there. Wasn't I wasn't located in the same place that Berlin is, that would have given me access to the information that would tell me about what's occurring there. And now, suppose your vacation ends, you leave Berlin, you fly back to, I don't know, Spain or wherever it is that you want to say that you're living at. You're no longer in Berlin experiencing what's happening there. You were in Berlin experiencing what's happening there, but you're not anymore. Did Berlin stop existing because you're no longer experiencing what's happening there? And again, I think the answer that most people would give is no, Berlin is still existing and things are still happening there. I'm just no longer present in that location to have access to the information telling me about what's occurring there. This is time. Time can be viewed very analogously to space, where, like I said earlier, you can have 2 points in space and 2 objects at each point, and only have access to one of those objects, only be able to know about one of those objects. But because you can't know about the other object, it does not necessarily mean it's not there. Same thing with time. You can have 2 things that are in time, that are separate from one another, but you only have access to one of them. So a good analogy would be 1932 in the tenseless view exists. It doesn't still exist, because the word still generally implies an endurance through time up to the present moment, which wouldn't be the right way to look at it. It exists, but it doesn't still exist. We're just not in 1932 to have access to the information that would tell us about what's happening there. 2032 exists. We're just not in 2032 to be experiencing what's happening there, to know about it. But because we don't have access to these points in time, doesn't mean they don't exist. Just like with the Berlin example, just because you don't have access to certain points in space, doesn't mean there aren't still things happening at that location in space. This is space-time. We might not be present at some defined location in space-time, but there is still an object or some event there that is still doing things, even if you don't have access to it. And this is what the tenseless theory of time says. Why is it that most philosophers, relevant philosophers and physicists, accept the notion of tenseless time over the notion of tense time? And that's because it's implied by the physics. One of the best examples to go to is our GPS satellites. The clocks on our GPS satellites literally tick faster than clocks on Earth, because they are further outside of Earth's gravitational well. So gravitational time dilation is not as severe, so the clock will tick faster than it otherwise would present on Earth's surface. And we actually have to continuously correct for this. If we didn't, over the course of 24 hours, if you tried to use a GPS system, your accuracy would be off by about 7 miles. The fact that such is the case implies that time actually is different for differing observers based on the gravitational field that they're in and how fast they're moving. We also know that objects that are moving very, very quickly experience a dilated time. Time slows down for them. And, a lot of this is not intuitive, but it's consistent with our observations. It's consistent, rather directly implied by all of our mathematics. And these are some of the reasons why tenseless time is taken to be the case, because there isn't tensed time. The A theory of time tells us essentially that there is an absolute moment of time that is universal across the entire universe. That right now, for us, is right now everywhere in the universe. Special relativity shows us that's not the case. Look at our GPS satellites. Right now for us isn't. Right now for the guys on the International Space Station even. Their time is different than ours. We would be T1, they would be T2. And we could both observe some event and observe it to happen at two different times because what we're observing happening, or rather when we're observing this event happen, is relative to our location. And this is one of the most foundational tenets of special relativity, is that there is no preferred spatio-temporal frame of reference. There isn't one frame of reference, a way, a place, or a point from which you observe things happening, a frame of reference that is universal, that you could observe everything else from. We don't have those. What you measure and how you measure it oftentimes depends on the frame of reference from which you're measuring it. A good thought experiment, well, not really thought experiment, just sort of an explanation that puts that into intuition, would be, imagine that you're in a car going at 60 miles an hour. If you're in the car, well, you're also moving at 60 miles an hour with the car. So relative to you, the car is not moving at all. But relative to somebody standing outside the car is moving past them at 60 miles an hour. So the velocity that the car has is relative to how you measure it. Are you measuring it from within the car, or are you measuring it from without the car? The speed that you get, 0 or 60, is going to depend on that. So that kind of puts that notion of what a frame of reference is and what it means to say there is no preferred frame of reference. Another good one is the same car moving past a pole at 60 miles an hour. There's an equivalence between saying the car moves past the pole at 60 miles an hour and saying the pole moves past the car at 60 miles an hour. Mathematically, there's absolutely no difference between those. And that's one of the, there's really two equivalence principles. That's the one for special relativity. There's one for general relativity, but that's different. So these are the notions that we get from physics and that we see actually in the real world that we have to correct for, otherwise things don't work. This is why tenseless time is adhered to. What are the arguments in favor of tensed time? Well, quite frankly, there really aren't any. It's just, well, that's what we intuitively experience, and we should trust that. Even though what we know about our universe, our reality, tells us that we shouldn't trust that. I mean, there's a lot of things that our intuitions tell us that we know is not actually the case. This is one of them. And this is the thing with tensed versus tenseless time debates, is that for those arguing for a tensed view or an A-theory view, there isn't much they can point to that indicates that this is the case outside of our subjective experiences of time. Whereas somebody arguing from a tenseless perspective has mathematics to back them up. We have physics, we have direct observations of reality, like I've mentioned a couple here. All of these things telling us that right now is not the same across the entire universe. And if that's the case, time is not tensed. The tenses don't mean anything. They're words they're conventions of our mind that we developed as a means of explaining the reality as we experience it. And this is why we developed our scientific processes, our scientific methodologies rather, the way that we have, is to set aside these biases, to go beyond what our intuition tells us, and utilize things like experimental observation, verification through repeated testing, and corroboration through peer review to establish things because our intuitions might not be telling us they might not be giving us the right picture about how reality works. And this is a video I've wanted to make for a while, actually, because I think it's important to understand the distinction between tensed and tenseless time, and to understand why pretty much all physicists accept tenseless time, and why the vast majority of the relevant philosophers or metaphysicians who focus on time, or philosophy of science, what have you, also adhere to a tenseless time, because that's the one that we have evidence for. The reality that we observe is exactly the type of reality we would expect to observe if time were tenseless. The reality that we observe is not, thereby, the type of reality we would expect to observe if time were tensed. We wouldn't expect clocks to tick at different rates depending on how strong the gravitational field is that they're in, or how fast they're moving. These shouldn't have an effect on measuring time. But they do. And just to reiterate, this is why tense time is not really supported. The only philosophers that support it are philosophers like William Lane Craig. I believe, I might be wrong, but I think J.P. Moreland is another one that adheres to a tense time. Most of the philosophers that adhere to it are oftentimes apologists, and there are reasons why they prefer a tensed time over a tenseless time, but I'm not going to really get into that. It's beyond the scope of this particular video. But I just wanted to make a video providing my thoughts on the matter, making the distinction between what tensed time is, or the A theory of time, versus the tenseless or the B theory of time, and what the reasons are for considering one over the other is. And I mean, it might sound like I'm oversimplifying, but there really isn't anything outside of, well, that's what we experience that supports a tensed or an a-theoretical notion of time. So if you know anybody that likes to talk about tense time versus tenseless time, or if you know anybody that adheres to a tense theory of time, or maybe doesn't know what they adhere to between the two, feel free to show them this video. Also, if you've been watching my channel, if you like the content that you see, do consider subscribing. I'd like to grow the Lion's Den so that we can expand the reach that we have when communicating science and correcting pseudoscientific misinformation. And as always, folks, per causam nos perfectum, or through reason we progress.